Welcome to Learn Data Science with KNIME.
There's 4 different little mini exercises here. I'll walk through them with you guys, and if you have questions, we can address those. And that's kind of our goal for the rest of the last hour here. So we'll walk through some of these exercises. We'll talk about how these different techniques can be used to move your workflows, your models, your just kind of data processing pipelines into some kind of deployment um, infrastructure. And if that means producing some kind of visual dashboard or report, or maybe it means interacting with GET requests, or maybe it means just pushing data off to database tables. Those are kind of the 4 categories we're going to try to address with these little mini examples. And the first one we'll talk about is on creating these views. So we're going to call them composite views. And when we say composite views, what we mean is we create multiple different views. Maybe that's something like a bar chart. Maybe it means a line plot, a scatter plot, and we kind of combine them into one view, like a dashboard. So when we talk about composite views, that's just multiple individual views that are combined into one to create a dashboard. Okay, so we're going to walk through some of the instructions here on the first little mini exercise here. So this is the one on creating a composite view. So the first thing we need to do is we'll read in some data. So in this example, we're kind of building on top of things that group 1 and group 2 will have already done. So we're just going to assume that we have them done for now. So for example, one thing that group 1 is going to do is they're going to read in some data and clean it up. So that might be one of the things that group 1 does. Group 2 is then taking that cleaned data and building a model, generating some kind of prediction on top of that cleaned data. And what we're going to do is we're going to use the model that group 2 has made, apply it to the data that group 1 has cleaned, and push it into some kind of deployment scenario. So when I talk about the model, so I'm going to read in this file here called best model. That's going to be one of the outputs of the group 2 track. So these are going to be things that are separate that we've already done, but all we're going to talk about right now is how to take these and deploy them once we have them. So the first thing we want to do is read in this data set here. So step 1 is read the data deployment.table. So we're going to do that one right here. So that's deployment.table. There's a couple ways we can read that in. I can use the table reader node, which I can just search for down here and drag it into my workflow. And then I could double click on that and browse to the location. But there's an easier way that I can do that. If I just click on this deployment.table over here in my KNIME Explorer, and this works just fine in the Windows Explorer or any other kind of window like that as well. If I click on that and I just drag it into my workflow, it'll automatically place the table reader node that I need to read the data. And a bit more than that, it'll also automatically populate the file location. So I don't have to worry about trying to browse to it. So I'll execute that. I can do that by right-clicking and selecting execute. Now we'll see that I have a green light underneath my table reader, and that's how I know that that node has finished running, and I now have that data inside of KNIME. You can see a little bit of a snapshot of what that table looks like down here in my node monitor, but if I want to see the full table, I can right-click on this node now that it's been executed, and at the very bottom I can select Read Table down here to look at that table. And it pops up in a full window like this. So I'll see all the different columns, all the different rows, their data types. I can look at the specs of them, etc. This is how I can kind of look at the actual form my data is in at any point in my workflow. So here's my here's our deployment.table data. So it's all of our information about that. Those airlines, what month it was, what day of the week it was, the departure time, and so on. So this is what we're going to try and generate predictions on top of. So remember that this data has already been cleaned by group 1, and we've already have a model trained to generate predictions on top of it by group 2. Okay. We've read in the data. The other thing we wanted to read in is this best model dot model, which is going to be a random forest model that group 2 has already trained. And we could do that just like we use the table reader here. We can use the model reader node for this best model. But we can also do the same thing we did with the deployment data. We can just take that model, drag and drop it right into our workflow, and it should populate. Let's see. I'm having a little bit of trouble with that, so I'll try to browse to it. In my KNIME workspace. Now this file could be located anywhere on my computer or even on other places, but I'm going to browse to it here in group 3. I'm using the wrong. 1 minute here. Okay, bear with me. I'm going to make sure that I copy the appropriate model so that we have the right one here. There we go. Now we have the model here, which I'm going to actually grab from solutions. Okay, give me 1 second here. So I'm going to grab the model from down here. Oops. Okay. Bear with me for 1 minute. Okay. I'm just going to write out this model really quick and then make sure I read it then. So I'm going to show you how to write a model really quick, and then we'll reread it back in cleanly. So here we have the model that was trained by group 2, and I'm just going to write it out to my desktop so we can get to it easily here. So this will be best model, and I'm still going to call it best model.model. Okay, and I'll write that out. And I can do that by executing the node. When I see this green light, which is like it meant that I had finished reading. In this case, it means that I finished writing. So now I'm going to go back over here. I'm going to get my model writer. Oh, sorry, I want the model reader now. I can grab that one, and I can browse over to my desktop, and I'll read in that model that I had just finished writing. Okay, and now you see that I've got the deployment data read in and my deployment model. So the one that had won the whatever kind of championship model choosing selection they had used in group 2. So that might mean that it had the highest accuracy, or that might mean something like it had the fastest deployment time. Maybe it generalized the validation data set very well. So there's different reasons why we might choose this best model. But in either case, we've done that, we've trained our model, and we have cleaned our data, and we've just imported them here. Okay. So the next thing we want to do is somehow apply this random forest model to our deployment data. So if I want to do that, I can go to I can search for random forest in here, and you'll see all of the nodes about random forests. There's random forest learners, there's random forest predictors, and a lot of the different model types available in KNIME are going to have this same kind of setup. There'll be a learner that trains the model, and there'll be a predictor that just deploys it on new data. So if I take in this random forest predictor, and I connect my model to it, and I connect the data that I want to predict on at these 2 different ports here, I can just run this now. And it'll take that input, run it through that random forest that we had trained in group 2. And now what we'll see is that when I look at the output data at the end of that random forest predictor, it looks like it did before. But if I scroll all the way over, I'll notice there's an extra column. And that's going to be called prediction. and then in parentheses, whatever the name of the column it was trying to predict. So we've got confidence, and we've also got the actual prediction. So it's predicting no delay with a 0.79 confidence, and so on. We can go down this and look at that. This is how we're going to generate predictions using models that have been trained in the past. We can just read in the model, use the appropriate predictor. In this case, we're doing a random forest predictor because we already know that they have trained a random forest model in group 2, and we're applying it to our deployment data. And now we have predictions. Okay. Now we'll talk about what we can do with this now we have our predictions. So one of the ways we might go forward and kind of deploy our model in production, meaning to in some way actually use this model, might be to create some kind of views, kind of dashboard. So the first thing we'll do for that, if we follow our list here, is we're going to create a little title output. So I'm going to use one of the nodes here, and this step 2 says we should use the text output widget. So I'm going to use this text output widget, and all this is going to do is if I go in here and I can format some text down here, and I'll just type in a title, and I'll call it flight statistics. Okay, so I just wrote some text down, and if I execute this, it'll just pop up with a little bit of text that says flight statistics. And I can format this in different ways. I can choose to use HTML and different options like that. So I'm going to remove that title, and I'm just going to leave the text as flight statistics for now. Now, if we wanted to be fancy, we could go in and make that bigger or bold by using HTML instead of plain text, or editing some CSS for the entire branch of visualization nodes that we're going to use. But for now, we'll just leave that title in that regular small text. Okay, so I've put down a title. I've used the text output widget node to create some text. And now we want to do some other stuff. So remember earlier I talked about building composite views. So that's one of the reasons why these are all going to come together a bit later. So I'm just putting down these little blocks that are going to come together to create some kind of dashboard a little bit later on. Okay. The next thing I want to do is look at the range slider node. So I think Scott may have demoed this one a little bit. But what this node is going to do is it's going to plug in to the output of any other node. And we're going to be able to use this interactive little filter here. So it'll let us slide up and down on some bar what data we want to actually visualize. So in this case, maybe we want to do that on the prediction confidence. Maybe we just want to see some outputs that are very confident. Maybe we want to do that on the day of the month. So there's different options we can look at for that. So in this case, I'll set it to day of month. And whenever we filter that, we'll have a little filter here that just adjusts how far into the month we are. So you can see that I'm just using this sliding filter, and that'll adjust what portion of my input table that I'm actually looking at. If I slide it all the way down here, I'll only be looking at days at the end of the month. If I take this and drag it back to the front, then I'm looking at days at the beginning of the month. And we'll plug this all together when we assemble our dashboard later. Now you saw that I could have kind of decimal values for that. So there's different ways that I can do that. So if I go over here and I kind of customize what my slider looks like, maybe I want to set it to use steps. So this means that whenever I move those sliders around, they'll always stop at steps of 1. So 1, 2, etc. Maybe I want to make that 7, so it chunks kind of by week. But I'll just leave it as a 1 for now. Okay, so we've got our predictor applied. We've got a title. We've got a little slider here for filtering our data based on the day of the month. And we're also going to assign color to the flights, so according to their departure status. So we'll do that with the color manager node. So I'll take that. And I'll just plug it right there into the output of the prior node in my workflow. I'll just execute this really quick. Oops. Don't need to see the view though. And we can open up the color manager. So I'm going to color code my records in my data set based on whether or not they're predicted to be delayed or not. So maybe I want them to be green if they're delayed or red if they're not delayed, but that seems a bit backwards. Maybe I want to switch those. Maybe I'll make it red for delay and green for not delay. So I can use different preset palettes, and there's different ways you can set those colors. Okay. So if I look at the output of this color manager node, I'll see a table again, but now I'll see that all of my rows in my table have a color assigned to them. So when we get to the part where we start putting together some actual graphics, we'll see that those rows will have their color at that point as well. Okay. So now we're going to actually visualize the relationship between the two features. So that's going to be, we're going to look at airtime and we'll look at arrival delay. And we'll do that with a scatter plot. It's a good way to look at two numeric features and trying to decide how well they're correlated. So if I do that, let's say I want airtime, or is that arrival time, or what did I want airtime? I'm forgetting. So it'll be airtime. Okay, let me switch that. We want to use airtime. Here we go, as well as the departure delay. I believe it was arrival delay. Close. Which I believe is this one. Okay. So now we have our X and Y axes on our scatter plot chosen. I can right click on that and just select execute and open views. That'll run the node and automatically produce my little plot here. So I can see that red is the delay and green is the no delay. And these are all separate flights, right? So that makes sense. So the higher air delay is, the more likely a flight is to be labeled delayed. If it's low down here, then that makes sense that they're not delayed. Okay. All right, so now we've looked at how we can put together one simple graph, the scatter plot. So maybe I want to look at the entire table. Maybe I want to see all of these records. So I can do something like that. If I want to put it right into a dashboard, I can use this node called the table view. So of course, as I'm working in KNIME, I can just right click on any node and select the bottom option down here to look at that output table. And I can just see it whenever I need to. But if I'm building a dashboard and I want to display that table, I'll need to use this table view node as it'll produce that table inside of that dashboard. So that's what we'll do here. We'll just connect the color manager to this table view. And if I run this and look at it, you'll just see that it's going to give us a view of the table. It looks a little different, a little bit more like something we would include in a dashboard. So maybe I don't want all of this data. Maybe I just want to look at a few things. So that's one of the things I'll have control of. If I open the configuration window, and I can do that by double clicking or right clicking and selecting configuration, I can select things like the title for my table. Maybe I'll call this example flights. And I can select which columns I want to include. Maybe I don't want to include all of these. Maybe I just want to include something like day of month, arrival time, flight number, air time, arrival delay, and departure delay. You just want to look at a few. I can do that as well. And then if I look at that interactive view from the table view, you'll see that I only have those columns now. And we can control how many records are on each page, for example, and how this table is interacted with. But here we have a view of a table. So now we talked about building these composite views. We have all these different individual views, but we want one composite view. And the way we can do that is by creating something that we're going to call a component. And components will combine views of any of these blue view creating nodes that we have inside of it. So if I want a component for my dashboard, I just need to make sure that I grab all of these blue nodes, right click on them, and select create component. Okay. So I'll just leave that and we'll call it flight dashboard. Okay. So now you'll see that those all got combined into this gray box that we're going to call a component that has all of those other nodes inside of it. And this is going to be able to combine them into one composite view. So I can go inside of this component by right-clicking on it, going to this component menu and selecting open, or I can hold control and just double click. Both of those will just take me right inside of that component, and I'll see all of the nodes that I had previously put in there. And just like before, where I could right click on one of those visualization nodes and select execute and open views, I can do the same thing here to execute and open the view on this flight dashboard. So maybe this isn't exactly how I want it laid out though, but you can see here that everything's being displayed in the same view, and that if I move my interactive filter around, it affects the table above, as well as the scatter plot down here below. Okay. Now, if I wanted to rearrange that dashboard, I can go inside of the component, which I can do again by control double clicking or right clicking on it and going to open inside of the component menu. But once I'm inside of this component like I am now, up at the top of your KNIME Analytics platform on this toolbar, you'll see this icon over here. It looks like a few different views kind of put next to each other to build some kind of composite view. So this is where we'll go to rearrange these views. So maybe I want my, let's see, how might I want to lay these out? I think it makes sense to put the table view way up at the top. And I think it makes sense to have our little interactive slider kind of at the bottom. And maybe I want my scatter plot and my table view to be right next to each other. There we go. I can rearrange them in ways like that. Okay, so now I've got something that might look a little bit better. So let's take a look at that. So again, if I right click on my component and select the interactive view, I'll see that everything's rearranged now. And there's different ways that you might rearrange this to make it look better. But we do see that my flight statistics is up at the top. I've got my table and plot right next to each other. And then at the very bottom, I have my little slider. Maybe I'd move my slider over here. Maybe I would give less space to my table. We've got a lot of different options here for how to rearrange those. But here's just an example of how you can combine different views and create some kind of composite dashboard. Okay, so that's one way we might deploy a prediction model. Maybe we have a model that generates predictions and we just want to create some little dashboard like that that can be placed on the KNIME web portal. People can just go to the link, look at the dashboard, interact with it a little bit, and get their information from the model. So that's one way we might consider deploying a model or a KNIME workflow. Are there any questions on how to build a composite view? Okay. So we'll talk about one other trick now that might be useful to you in a deployment scenario. So this one, we're going to talk a little bit about using a GET request. So one of the nice things about using KNIME is how easy it is to integrate with RESTful systems. So if we're using nimeserver and I deploy a workflow onto nimeserver, it can automatically be given REST endpoints. So that might mean that if you have an application that you need to plug this KNIME model into, you can just give it the REST endpoint and have it spit data in and receive a response from that KNIME workflow on the server. And you won't have to configure any of those manually. So that's a good way to embed KNIME workflows and KNIME models into bigger systems. In this example, though, I'm just going to show you how to send a GET request and receive some information back. So if you have a model and one of the features in that model is maybe the weather for today. So it would be a totally reasonable thing to do. If we were trying to, for example, forecast ice cream sales, and I wanted to try to guess how much ice cream I'm going to sell today, I'd probably have some kind of forecasting model there just based on that time series. But I might also try to embed additional variables on things like what's the weather today, right? Because if it's cold and rainy, even if I sold a lot of ice cream yesterday, I'm probably not going to sell that much today. So this would be one way to kind of embed additional variables into your models, is to use these kinds of GET request systems to reach out to external providers and get that data back. So in this case, we're going to reach out with a GET request. So there's different ways you can use this node. You'll notice this white little triangle on the left side of it. That signifies an optional input port for a KNIME node. That means I can plug something into it, but I don't have to. If I did plug something into it, it would automatically use whatever text was in that data to send its GET request off. In this case, we're just going to write a very simple one. and we won't need to worry about automating that. But if you did have a GET request that was changing regularly, we could do that. So I'm just going to go into this annotation up top where we're talking about the goal and the suggested steps here. And the query to use to access this data is just this address here. So I'm going to copy that. And I'll go into my GET request. And I'm just double clicking on it to open up the configuration dialog. And I'm going to paste into it what that URL that I wanted to send off was. Okay, so in this case, that's all I need to do. And I can run that GET request. It'll send the request and I'll get a response back. And this is going to be structured however that external system, however that one works. So in this case, we're getting this JSON back. We've got the name, the license, the website, and a few other things in here. But really, we want to have that in a table form, right? We want to be able to use it with the other data in KNIME. So there's a whole bunch of nodes for working with JSON here. So there's different ones that help us kind of parse through JSONs, create JSONs, validate JSONs, and so on. But what we want to do right now is we want to take this JSON and we want to turn it into a table. So there's a node in here specifically called JSON to table. So we're going to take that one. So I'll take that and I'll plug in the output of my GET request. I'm just going to select the column that contains my JSON, which in this case is the only one available, that body column. I'll just click OK. So I'm going to execute that. And what it's going to do now is going to take that JSON and produce a table in it instead, which each one of those values being converted to a column. So I know my status and a few other things here. So what I've received then is a little bit of information about the flight. Okay, so that's how I might embed a GET request into a KNIME workflow. If you were receiving JSONs from a KNIME workflow, if you had scheduled it on the KNIME server, for example, you may accept a JSON, convert it into a table, run it through some of your predictive models, turn it back into a JSON, and return it. So there's different ways that we can embed into JSON systems. Okay. Any questions on this little example here? Any questions on what you can and can't do with RESTful services with KNIME? Any questions on JSONs? And feel free to come back to earlier stuff earlier or later if a question does pop up. But if there are no questions on that, I'll just pop over to the next example here. That is not it. Okay. So one of the other scenarios we might run into when we're trying to deploy these models that we've built, these workflows that we've built, is we might just want to take that data. Maybe we're ingesting some raw data from a bunch of Excel files that somebody sticks in a folder on, I don't know, SharePoint or something. We want to read them all in, clean them all up. We want to do some modeling on top of them, and then we want to take those results and we want to push them. We just want to push them to a database. Maybe that's how we ingest and clean our data. So this is what we're going to talk about a little bit here, is how we can push data into a database. So we'll start again by reading in the deployment data, as well as that best model from group 2. Okay. Let me find where I was at. All right, here we go. So here's my deployment table. So this was the same data we read in on that first example. It's just all of our flight information that we're using as an input to our random forest model. I'm also going to use that model reader, and that'll let me read in my random forest model that we've already trained in group 2, which I've just stuck on my desktop. Okay. I can run that. Now I've got my model read in as well as my deployment table. Okay, so these are my two little data sets. This could be an Excel file, it could be a CSV, could be whatever it is that we're working with as a source. This could be another database. It could be the same database. But what we're going to do now is we're going to apply the random forest again. So remember, we need to know what kind of model this is before we can apply it. So we'll use the random forest predictor. And I'm going to rearrange these a little bit so it looks prettier. Okay. I'll plug in the data that I want to generate predictions for, as well as the model. And I can just execute that. And just like before, it'll be the same input table, except with my prediction and my prediction confidence tagged on the end now. Okay, so before we had taken this and we then built some kind of dashboard that we might have put up in the KNIME web portal for people to just kind of go to the link, look at it, interact with it, get their information, and move on. In this case, maybe we want to push that prediction information off to a database. Okay, so how we can do that is we can use, and I'm going to example or demo this with a SQLite database, which is just a local file. And this will be on here under data. So you'll see this file in here called deployment.sqlite. So if I just drag that in here, it'll automatically populate a SQLite connector. And there are different database connectors for different databases that you can use. So if we go in here and I look at, maybe I type in connector, you'll see a lot of different connector types in here. So there's a generic database connector called DB connector. There's a Google BigQuery connector, Microsoft Access, and that list just keeps going. If you don't see the specific database that you typically use in here, you can use the regular old DB connector. And if you have a driver already, a jdbc driver, then you can just plug in the jdbc driver, and this DB connector will work with anything that you have. So on some proprietary databases, that might be the way you have to go. But for this example, we have a dedicated SQLite connector. Okay. So this is just going to, it's already configured. And this is where I would input things like the address of my database, my username and password if I use one, or whatever kind of information we need to connect to it. If I run this, now all I've done is establish a connection to that database. Okay. Now, if I look at these DB nodes again, you can kind of see them. I'm going to just browse through them in my node repository here. So there's different ones for connecting, which is where we would get my SQLite connector, for example. There's different ones for helping us write queries. Maybe I want to do some auto binning on my database before I read it into KNIME. Maybe I want to sort them. Maybe I want to filter them, group them. These are just nodes that will help you compose SQL queries, basically. And that will all be executed on the database side. So for example, if I'm reading from some cloud database and I've got this massive table up there, but I don't want to read it all into KNIME because it'll bog my laptop down, maybe I want to just read it. Maybe I want to do some filtering up there. Maybe I want to do some aggregation, and I'll do that all on the database side by using these nodes to configure my SQL query that I then send off as a request to that database. Okay, but in this case, what we're going to try to do is we're going to try to write something. So I've generated my predictions, and now I want to write to the database. So I can use this node called the DB writer. So it'll have me select, I have to connect my connection. So I've now connected my SQLite to the DB writer. That will tell my DB writer node that it is writing to that database. And we need that connection. And then I'll connect my output from the random forest predictor. And that's how we'll have the table that actually gets written. Now I have to configure this a little bit here as well. I have to select which columns I want to write to the database. I don't have to write all of them. I could keep some. Maybe I don't want to write out CRS arrival time. Maybe I don't need that one for some reason. And there's different things we can do here. You can select different options for erroring. We can select the batch size. This is a good one to keep in mind. If you're using mostly numeric data, you might see some speed ups by increasing this number. If you're using a lot of text data, so you've got rows containing maybe multiple sentences or even multiple paragraphs, you might want to lower this number. Because this is just going to determine kind of the chunk that you send off to your database. If it's too low, then maybe your ping is going to be the major limiting factor in how quickly you can upload. If it's too high, we might see some buffering issues. So just something to keep in mind. is a great default value, but if you do know that you're using a particularly narrow or particularly wide table, then just keep that in mind. Okay, so I can just browse through here to select a table that I want to write to, or I can just type in my own. Maybe I want to write a new one, and I'm just going to call it new table. Okay. Now that I've selected which columns I want to write and what the name of the table that I'm writing to is, I can just execute that. And now I'll see that it's green, indicating that I've written that data into my SQLite database. And if I went back over here and I use a DB reader, oops, slightly different one. I want to use the table selector. I want to look through the tables that are currently in my database. So if I do this, I can browse my tables, just looking at the different tables that are in that database schema, and I see my new table appears there now. So if I just click OK on that, I can run that. You'll notice that this one doesn't actually have the black output port. So the black output ports indicate data ports that are in KNIME. So over here, I've read my table into KNIME. I've got that data included in KNIME now. I've generated my predictions with that random forest model, and that outputs, again, data in a KNIME format. But over here, I don't have any. That's because this red block here at the output of the connector just indicates a database connection. So there's actually no data there, it's just a connection. And then I have this kind of brown block at the output of the DB table selector. So this is kind of when I'm looking at data in my DB framework. So this is where I could do stuff like maybe I want to add some filtering, and I can do this on the database side. Maybe I want to do some aggregations. I want to use my group by. Maybe I want to try to use this DB joiner and I want to join two different tables that are both inside of this same database. I can do that as well. So this is where I could write or compose my SQL queries before sending off that request to the database and pulling all that information into KNIME. So this is very useful if you've got a big database table and you don't want to download the entire thing when you run your workflow. But that being said, we can see these intermediate steps still. That's one of the strengths of using a system like KNIME, is that when I run through my workflow, I can actually look step by step at what my table looks like. So I can kind of look for errors that way. I can make sure everything looks clean, and I can still do that when I'm using these database connections. I'll just click this button to cache a certain number of rows. Default is 100, and it'll just download the first 100 results from that query as it stands wherever I'm at in my workflow. So if I added a filter, it would filter it and then grab the first 100 and download those. So we can still see the intermediate steps as we go through and use these DB nodes here. Okay, so that's one other way we might go about deploying a model. Maybe it's just something we use in between ingesting raw data and writing into our database system. Okay, any questions about writing to databases? There's a lot in here, of course, but we won't have time to talk about all of it. So if there's a specific thing that's interesting, let me know, and we can touch on that. Okay, and I do have one more mini example as well. So there's a question in the chat now about which nodes I think are most useful. The ones that kind of come up a lot in my experience are, of course, something like the group by. So I'll show you how that one works a little bit. And it works just the same as the regular group by does in the KNIME system. So maybe I'll select a table here. I want to use my new table, the one I just read. I'll connect it to my group by. And then I'll be able to go into here and I'll start configuring how I want to do aggregations. So maybe I want to look at day of month. Those are my groupings. So I'll have one record per day of month. And maybe for that record, I also want to know, maybe I want to know which one of these might be interesting. Maybe something like arrival delay. I can look at these different aggregation options now. And these will vary a little bit depending on which SQL dialect your database uses. So maybe I want to look at the sum of all of the arrival delays by day. Maybe I want to look at the average. What was the average arrival delay for each day of the month? So I could do something like that. I could execute that. And I can look at that just like before by caching it. And it's just a small table like this. So now if I wanted to read that in with the reader, so there's just like there's a DB writer, there's also a DB reader. Now, if I wanted to download data from the database in this fashion, I could just connect the reader at the end of my query string here. So that was just the group by, and I can run this. And that'll read my data in to KNIME much quicker than it would if I had tried to download the entire table and then do my group by. So I think it's important to keep in mind that if you can do any of your data pre-processing on the database side, that you should try to do so. Let's look at some of the other ones really quick. Those will all be under database and then query if we're looking at ones to use to write queries. Of course, just filtering stuff is helpful for trimming down the size of your data. We can do sampling as well. So if you're trying to do some machine learning on data from a table, maybe you've got this massive table of data, but you don't want to use all of it. Maybe it just won't fit in your laptop. Maybe it's just not practical and it takes too long. One of the things that we can do, and this isn't only true with databases, but one of the things we can do is try to use different sampling techniques to trim down our training set for building models. So that might be a way to kind of trim down the data we're looking at. If you just wanted to look at maybe the distribution of flights that were delayed and not delayed, but you didn't care about the total numbers, doing something like this random sampling might be a good way to do that, but faster. So just something to keep in mind. There's a lot of ways that we can speed up our processing times without affecting the actual output of our task here. Okay. Let me see if I can find the last one. Well, we did the composite view. Okay, here's the one I missed. So there's another one here about BERT. So I'm not sure how many of you will ultimately go forward and use BERT, but I'm going to talk a little bit about what it is. So at least you'll have the option. So a lot of the times when we introduce KNIME and we show some of the graphs, people will ask us about Tableau. Are we competing with Tableau? Are we the same as Tableau? What makes us different? But ultimately, at the end of the day, KNIME is not a dashboarding tool. I mean, as you saw in the first example I showed you, when I put together some of those composite views, we can build dashboards and they are interactive with KNIME. But it's not going to be the same as having something like a Power BI or Tableau report. We don't really consider ourselves competitors in that space. What KNIME is for is it's for ingesting tons of different data types, doing all of this processing and cleaning and modeling and generating these predictions. And you don't have to build those dashboards inside of KNIME. We have connectors specifically for tools like Power BI, which I don't have installed right now, and Tableau, which I also might not have installed right now. But there are connectors, and you'll see them on the KNIME hub, and I can show them to you. Am I spelling it wrong? Yeah, I am spelling it wrong, but I also don't have that installed. So there's extensions available for both Power BI and Tableau. And those will just let you push data into those systems, and those may populate reports over there. So BERT is a open source dashboarding tool that is directly embedded inside of KNIME. So you can use that in here, even if you don't have access to something like Power BI or BERT, or you don't want to use the composite dashboards that we showed you before. These are nice for a couple of reasons. They're great if you want to schedule a workflow, have it produce a PDF report, and then have those reports just get emailed off to people every day. So that's something that I do personally. I make a few very simple BERT reports. So maybe I've got this complicated workflow, it generates all of these forecasts, and I want to send maybe every Monday a report to a few people so that they know what to expect from the week. So I can do that with BERT very easily. It'll embed very nicely into KNIME. If I schedule some kind of workflow and it ends with a BERT report, that I can have that scheduled workflow then send that PDF report to whoever needs it. Now I can also do that with a web portal. but then they wouldn't get it in their email. They would have to go to the web portal and click on it. So think of how Tableau can send PDF reports. This is something more in vein with that. So we're going to walk through a little bit on how to do that. Okay, so I'm actually going to jump back over here to this example where we've already read in our data and we've already generated our prediction. Okay, so maybe I want to look at that scatter plot again that we looked at before. So I'll take that. I'll connect my predictions to it. And they're definitely, I'll show you where to find some examples, Mandy, and I'll show you a little bit of what we can do quickly here today. But I will make sure to link some examples before we wrap up. So I'm going to use the color manager here because I had forgotten. And we're going to make sure that we have some different colors. So maybe I want delay to be red because that makes more sense. Come on. There we go. Kept missing. And maybe I want no delay to be green. Okay, it's a little bit more intuitive. All right, so I'll open up my scatter plot, and what should we plot this time? Maybe I'll plot, we'll use arrival delay. So I want to use arrival delay on the y-axis, and on the x-axis, we'll use distance. Oh, no, that's not what I thought it was. Trying not to use the same exact ones I used last time. We'll use day of month. So this should look pretty random. I don't know why day of month would affect arrival time, so we might not want to see any correlation here. Okay, so that makes sense. I don't see a lot of pattern in this. Of course, it is chunked, so it's right on these integer lines here for the day of the month, which makes sense. But it does look pretty random. We don't see any correlation here. But I don't want to talk too much about the usefulness of that scatter plot. I want to talk about how to use it with BERT. So if we check this box up here, create image at output. So I'll rerun that, and now we'll see that I have this green box up here on the right side of my scatter plot node that had a red X on it before. Now it's lit up and it's green. That just means that a image has been generated by this plot. So in this case, it's a little 800 by 600 pixel SVG image. And we can write that out to a file. We could save it, use it in a PowerPoint presentation. But what we're going to do now is we're going to push it to a BERT report. Now, we don't have to do it that way. Another thing we can do is just send data straight to reports. But I'm going to show you those here. Data to. Yeah, so we have data to report. And this will just let us send a full data table to the BERT system where we can display it, generate different graphics on it, a lot of the things you'd normally expect from that kind of dashboarding system. And we can also send images to report. So we can do that with the node image to report. And I'll just connect that green box to this one. Now it's important to give these proper node descriptions here. So I haven't been doing that for the most part, but in this case, it's very helpful. And that's because when this image gets moved over to the BERT system, it's going to have a name that matches its node description. So this will just make it easier for us to remember what's what. So this will be my prediction data, and that one will be my scatter plot. Okay, so now if I run these, and they show green, that means they've sent the data to my report. Now there's an extension for BERT, so it's a free to use extension. There's lots of extensions available in KNIME. You see one over here in my repository right now, the image extension. So there's a lot of different types. And once you have this BERT extension installed, you'll have this little box up here in your toolbar. So this opens the report associated with your current workflow. So now that I've sent some data and an image to my BERT report, I'm going to click on this little icon. And that'll open up this BERT editing system. And it'll prompt you to save a couple things as it imports into the new framework. And we'll have some different things that we can do here. So it's not the most modern of dashboarding tools. It's nothing like Power BI or Tableau, but it does give us a good bit of customizability, and it does give us a lot of different options for ways that we can output these kinds of reports. So maybe I've generated my scatter plot, and this was my image that I had straight from a KNIME plotting node. I can just drag this, and I can place it. Oops, do this properly. So I'll drag this little image thing here. So that's one of the options for report items that I can place into this dashboard. And let me try to find it right. Oops. Bear with me here a little bit. I don't usually use the image thing in BERT. I'll show you how to place a graph first, just so we don't get too lost. So I'll place a chart. So I'll be able to pick a different kind of charts. So there's stuff like bar charts, line plots, etc. Maybe I just want to place a basic bar chart. I'll then be able to go over here and configure how I want this bar chart to work. And I can select which of my data sets that I've imported into this system that I want to use. So in this case, maybe I want to use that prediction data. Okay. So I've got a few different things here. So which column contains my categories for the x-axis? Maybe I want that to be whether or not my flight is predicted to have a delay. So that would give me 2 bars. And then up here, maybe I want to use something like let's see, what would be a good one? I'm looking for arrival delay. There it is. Okay. And we can apply functions on top of that as well. So there's different ways that we can manipulate this. But here would be a very basic example of a bar chart that could be embedded into a BERT report. So that's just applied in here, and it'll scale in there and fit. We can add different text options in here. So if I just wanted to write some text, this is my bar chart. Select OK. And I can do different things like this with it. Now, I actually have to go through and preview what this looks like as a PDF. So there's different ways I can do that. And I'm just going to go up here to these different views options. There's lots of different ways I can look at it, but I'm going to select view as PDF. So that'll create a PDF for it. And I don't think it likes me too much. Well, here's a different one that I had created a little before that you can kind of see. So this is what one of those PDF reports might look like. So in this case, I'm generating just a graph per slide with the intention of using them in presentations later. So I see a question in the chat about, can you make dynamic dashboards or reports in BERT? The answer to that one is no, the BERT reports won't be dynamic or interactive. If you want to use dynamic or interactive reports with KNIME, the way to do that would be back here through this composite view. You can, and that again, will be able to create a web portal that you can interact with and see in different ways. So again, this one in particular isn't very pretty, but there are much nicer examples of interactive views out there. So if you wanted an interactive dashboard, then you could definitely do that with these composite views and the KNIME web portal.
Thanks for watching. Hit the like button to let us know you've enjoyed this video and subscribe for more data science content. Visit grmds.org through the link in the description to access KNIME workflows and other valuable data science resources like online courses and webinars. Sign up is free.